Hey everybody, welcome to another Avid Media Composer tutorial, and this one's on working with HDR media and HDR footage and exporting in HDR. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, so this means in contrast to SDR, or Standard Dynamic Range, which is what we were used to for a long time with HD media, was all in SDR. High Dynamic Range means you have a broader color palette, there's more colors available to choose from, and even more importantly, there's a broader dynamic range, a bigger range of brightness levels, so you can have a bigger difference between the darkest and the brightest stuff. And this is great. It can make your images look more vibrant, more realistic, opens up some different color grading possibilities, so that's all well and good. However, we're in this transitional period right now where some stuff is still in SDR, some stuff is in HDR, and a lot of our workflows aren't necessarily equipped to handle it, and we're not used to doing it. So I decided to make this because a bunch of my students in recent days have run into some problems. Either they had some HDR media that their phones recorded. A lot of newer cell phones will allow you to record your video in HDR in one flavor or another. And then they were bringing it into their sequences and their editor wasn't treating it properly and things were getting distorted or looking weird. Or it was treating it properly, they were then having problems when they went to export it, or they would export it properly, but then they'd go to show it in class and it'd be showing on a projector that was not equipped to handle HDR, and so their image would look really blown out and weird. And so they were just running into all these different problems. So let me give you just a quick example of what I'm talking about, and no matter where you're watching this, you should be able to see the really blatant differences here. So this is an original clip that one of my students shot in HDR, so here's the original clip, what it's supposed to look like. And just to sort of verify that, here's a photo I took of my laptop screen. Again, not 100% perfect because you're getting it through my camera on my phone, but you can kind of see it looks about the same like that. That's what it was supposed to look like. So then in contrast, when we put it up on the projector in class, this is what it looked like. This is not an artifact of the photo I was taking with my cell phone. This is how it actually looked to your eye. Almost the entire right half of the image is completely blown out. There's no detail. And a lot of the other parts are as well. Some of the colors are shifted weirdly. So things were just not looking correct, and it's because that projector could not handle an HDR image. Now I was able to convert the file to an SDR, standard dynamic range video, and put it up on the projector, and this is a photo of what it then looked like up on the screen at that point. I will tell you, to the naked eye, and I think also to the camera as well here, it was not quite as vibrant as the full HDR version was supposed to look like, but it also was displaying correctly, and there's a huge value in that. So I'm going to show you how to do this, as one of the things we go through is take your HDR images and export a SDR version of them for handing in to your professors, in my case. If you're not sure where this is going to be shown, and it might be being shown on equipment that is not capable of displaying that. In fact, you can even run into problems with HDR equipment because there are different versions or flavors of HDR. So this clip was actually shot by the student and encoded in Dolby Vision, which is a particular encoding form of HDR. We played it back on a television that was HDR capable and could handle the broader dynamic range and color palette, but it did not have Dolby Vision, so it didn't know what to do with that. And on the TV, we got something that looked like this. So it's not quite as bad as that first one I showed you on the projector, but we're still blowing out almost this entire right side, not getting that full contrast and stuff we had. And again, the issue was the display unit, the monitor we were showing it on, just didn't know what to do with that Dolby Vision encoding. So these are the kind of problems you can run into when you're dealing with HDR stuff. And again, hopefully a few years down the road, these will all be things of the past, fingers crossed, but at the moment, these are real problems that crop up. So what I want to show you how to do today is how to work with HDR stuff within Avid Media Composer and just handle it properly and make sure you're getting out the stuff you want. Two quick notes. One is I'm just focusing on workflow and the technical stuff you need to do to make sure you're handling that media correctly and that it is looking the way that it should. I'm not going to get into how to color grade for HDR or how to shoot for HDR or where you're getting HDR footage versus SDR footage. That's a whole separate thing on the sort of acquisition side and also on the creative aspect of how to do a good HDR color grade and stuff like that. That'll maybe be a topic for a later tutorial if people are interested. But at the moment, I just want to focus on the sort of technical steps you need to do to just work with this footage properly so you don't get weird things outputting or weird things when you try to look at your footage. And the second thing is I'll just note that I'm recording this in October 2023 and I'm working with Media Composer version 23.8.0. And this is all accurate as of this timing and this version. Avid workflows tend to be pretty stable and not change a whole lot between versions. I think Avid's much better than that, frankly, than a company like Adobe that completely changed everything every time they do a new release. So my expectation is all the things I'm showing you and kind of where you can find things in menus and how to go about doing it is going to stay relatively constant between versions, but there's no guarantees. You know, Avid might decide to change something. And also, as HDR gets more common and more people are working with it, they might find they need to make some of those workflows more obvious or have different things that are done automatically that you don't have to set. So again, this is accurate as of this moment, but if you're listening to it in the future, just use a little bit of caution and make sure things make sense and are actually working in whatever version of Avid you might be using at that point. Okay, so let's get to it. I have a couple of demo clips that we'll be working with here, so I just want to show you those. So here's one. These were both from students who were nice enough to give me copies of a couple of clips they shot so I could play with these and figure out how this HDR stuff should work for them. So this one is a clip that was recorded in HDR, and if I want to see that, I open it up in QuickTime Player and I can open up the inspector, Command-I, and it'll be under video details here. So I can see up here the codec it's in HEVC or the H.265, but I need to go down into these details to find out if it's an HDR clip. So in this case it is. You'll see it says the color primary is BT.2020, transfer function BT.2100 HLG, which stands for hybrid log gamma. I don't want to get too much into technical details, but these are things you should know if you're going to be working with color spaces. So anytime I see this 2020 color space, it might say BT.2020, it might say Rec.2020. Those are referring to the same thing. It has to do with a particular specification from, I forget what this stands for. It's like International Telecommunications Union or something like that. Anyway, it's some engineering standard, but this specifies a particular color space, and this is our HDR color space. If I'm working with a standard dynamic range color space, so my normal HD color space, we'll see that that's 709. So you should just recognize these numbers. And this one that says 2100, that essentially is this color space with also some information about the transfer function, which there's a few different variations of. For our purposes today, I'm not getting super into the technical weeds of this. If you see 2020 or 2100, think, okay, this is an HDR clip. Also notice that this clip was actually encoded using Dolby Vision, which is kind of a different metadata form that sits on top of HDR and kind of allows you to use it more efficiently or a little better, but it's still within that larger HDR space, whether it's Dolby Vision or HDR 10 Plus or whatever. Okay, so I can say this is an HDR clip. And also note, I have my display set not to show it in full HDR because I found out my screen capture software doesn't actually work well when I have it set to that. So I'm not viewing it in its full HDR glory here, but hopefully viewing it in a way that it'll show up correctly on the screen capture. You should still be able to see when we're doing things wrong, you'll see very definitely that the image looks much distorted. This is really about how it's supposed to look, although if I had the full dynamic range on, it would look a little brighter in these bright areas and a little darker in the darks. Okay. And then I also have one SDR clip just so we can compare the two. So you can probably tell even just from looking at this, looks a little bit flatter, not quite as much dynamic range available, meaning not quite as big a difference between the brightest and darkest parts, and some of the colors aren't quite as vibrant. If I do the same thing, go to the inspector on here, this is a H.264. You can see here, this is in that 709 color space, 709 transfer function. That's our, what we call standard dynamic range SDR. This is what we're used to with HD footage. If you happen to have anything from the pre-HD days, like old standard definition stuff from before high definition was a thing, the color space for that is actually 601. So if you see 601, that's what you're talking about, and that's an even narrower color space than what we have with HD, which is pretty good, but then HDR gives us even more than that. Okay, so I got these two clips, and I'm going to go into Avid, and there are a few different ways I could work with HDR footage within Avid. But no matter what I'm doing, I need to kind of think about three different places where I could be changing the color space, and I need to be aware of what it is. So the first is at the project level. So what is my project itself set to? And that's also going to affect any sequences in that project. The second is the clips and kind of what's being done with those. And then the third is when I go to get something out of here and I'm exporting it, what is that export set to? And we'll kind of see how the three of these interrelate. The way I'm going to show you here what I'm recommending for my students is kind of the simplest, and I'll also show you there is a way that's a little more complicated but also gives you a little more flexibility. But I think this is the simplest if you're just trying to get your HDR footage in here and then ultimately spit out either an HDR or an SDR export. So first thing I want to do is check my project settings. So I'll open up settings, Command, comma, right here on the Format tab, you'll see it has a choice for color space. And I'll note you can set this when you create a project. So when you're creating a project, you can choose what this is going to be, but you can also change it after. And in fact, you can change it at any time while you're working, and it'll kind of change how things work going forward. But one of the things we'll look at and I'll show you how to do is sometimes it's useful to be able to change this in the middle of a project. So right now I am set to, you can see if we decode this a little bit, there's kind of a choice of whether I want to work in RGB or YCBCR, and I'm not going to get into the details of that here. I'm going with YCBCR. But then you can see it's that 2020 color space and it's hybrid log gamma. So it's the same thing as that clip I had. You remember it said it was bt.2020 and then had in parentheses HLG hybrid log gamma. So this is working in that flavor of HDR. I could choose a different flavor if I wanted. You also see several of these have that 709. That's that SDR color space. But I'm going to just leave this as this for right now because that's what that HDR clip I have is already in. So I'm just going to kind of leave it in that color space. So then I'm going to import my clips, and I'm going to do this the normal way with the source browser, grab both those clips, link them in, and just label those with what I want them to be. Okay, so I got my two clips in here. Here's my HDR one, here's my SDR one. And the reason that I wanted to double check the project space first is when I import a clip, it is going to kind of check it against the project color space and then adjust it if need be. And I honestly find the adjustments it makes by auto default are usually not the right ones or the ones I wanted. So what I wanted to do was just bring in particularly this HDR clip just as it was, not do any sort of transformations to it. So I set the project space to that. So I'm going to right click on this, go to source settings, and you'll see here it says the source color space is this Rec 2020 HLG. I have no idea why here it displays the HLG first and everywhere else in Avid it displays them the other direction, but that's what the source clip is, and that's the same as my project settings. You'll see it's not applying any color transformations here. This SDR clip on the other hand, so this is in that Rec 709 color space, and you'll see that here, but we're working in a different color space, right? The project is Rec 2020 HLG. And so you'll see it applies a bunch of color transformations here to try to get this reading correctly in this project's color space. And you'll notice it ends up looking kind of like washed out and darker. And that's kind of the norm when you bring SDR stuff into an HDR project. It's going to look a little darker because it doesn't have that very high end of brightness. So you might need to recolor grade things. On the other hand, if I took off all these transformations, you're going to see it looks kind of distorted in a different way. So it's kind of spreading out that brightness through the whole thing. But now, kind of look at this, things look pretty bright. I'm getting some like oversaturated colors and such. So this also doesn't look quite like I want it to. Up to you which of those you find easier to start with. In any case, if you're mixing HDR and SDR footage in the same sequence, you're going to have to recolor grade the SDR stuff to kind of match and get looking like the same color space as the HDR stuff and looking like the same brightness level so you don't obviously see when you cut from one to the other. So I'm going to revert this back to its original and just kind of show you. You can imagine if I'm cutting between these two shots, you can just see this one looks dimmer and a little duller, and so I'm going to need to do some sort of color grade to this one if I was really trying to match these in a sequence. Okay, so I've got that. Now that I've brought this in, what I suggest my students do, because I want them handing stuff in Rec 709 just so I know it will play correctly everywhere we play it here. So if that's what your end game is, now I'm going to go back into my project settings. I'm going to change this to YCBCR 709 and say the project is now in a 709 color space. And if I do nothing else, if I just work with these clips, it's going to let me export something that looks fine. I don't need to go in and manipulate these color transformations now. I can do them on the export end. If I wanted to go in here, I can go into my HDR clip because now this is the one that's kind of in the wrong space. You'll see it's HLG Rec 2020. But because I already brought it in when the project was at this, it didn't auto apply any transformations. So if I wanted to change this at the clip level, and again, this is where you have some more flexibility, but you don't need to do this. It will do it at the export level, and this works fine in Avid. I'm going to select the color adapter type generic, and for the color adapter, I'm going to go to the HLG 2020 to Rec 709, and it specifies the particular knee. You select that, and then you have to click Add to put this transformation in. One other thing I'll note that I kind of like about how the color transformations in Avid work is if I do that now and then I'm like, oh wait, I really should transcode this footage before I edit with it. If you've listened to any of my other tutorials, you know I'm not a fan of trying to edit with your linked footage. That's not what Avid really wants you to do, even though it'll let you do it. It's not as efficient. So I'm going to right click on these and transcode them. And I'm going to make sure where it says source transformations, I'm going to leave this unchecked, the color encoding, because I don't want to bake in any of those color transformations I've made. But here's where Avid actually does something pretty nice for you. Is I've got these converted clips now, so these have now been transcoded and made into Avid media. And what I'll note is I can right click on this, go to source settings, and you'll see it did not bake this in, but it's applying this same transformation here. So any transformations I had on the original clip, it's going to also assume you want those on your transcoded clip, but it'll let you take those off if you wanted, because I didn't check that box when I was doing the transcode, so it didn't bake these in. It's just applying them, and I can always get rid of them if I want. So I actually think that's pretty nice. So I got these clips. I'm going to just make a little sequence now. Test Avid HDR. And let's just take a very little bit of, a couple seconds of each of these clips, and we'll edit them in. Make a very short little sequence here. And again, you can see these don't match. I would definitely need to do some color grading on this second clip to get it kind of looking like this one. But I'm just going to leave this as is, select the whole thing. And now I'm going to go to do my export. And again, I said I'm going to do the export in the 709 standard dynamic range color space because that is what I want my students to turn in, so I know it'll play correctly everywhere. I will show you how to export something in HDR if you want to keep the extra dynamic range and color palette. So I'm going to just double check before I export that my project is still set to Rec 709 color space. And then I've got this selected and I'm going to export it. So go File, Export, Export to File. And if you had an export setting preset to do this, you could do it. I'm just going to mess with this one and then reset it back when I'm done. So you'd set all your other settings however you normally would in terms of whatever your export format is, any of your use marks and this stuff, whatever you're doing with your audio and such like that, resolution, all these things. The thing that I want to check here that's going to be potentially a little different is color space. And this is something that most of the time you probably don't pay much attention to, you just sort of leave it as the default. But this is part of your export settings, is what is your color space. So you can see here it says the project is Rec 709, and right now this export setting is set to do it as a Rec 2020 HLG. I don't want that. I want to export it in Rec 709, match the project, and I want to make sure my video levels are keep at legal range. Okay, so I'm going to do that, export it, and here's my clip. And if you look at it, that looks about like it looked in Avid. Right, so that kept things correct. That did what I wanted to do. If I open up the inspector here, you can see it is in fact in a 709 color space, and transfer functions, this is working correctly, and this will play correctly everywhere. That's great, that's what I wanted. Now, just to show you that this would work even if I had not done a color transformation on the original clip, let me go back to this clip here, go to source settings, and I will take off this transformation that put it into that SDR color space. So see if I go back in here, there's now no color transformation being done on the clip level. My project is still at 709, and I'm going to export this. You'll see again, it's still exporting it at Rec 709 in that SDR color space. So the project is in that color space, the export is in that color space, but I did not change the clip or do a transformation on the clip in this case. So I'll export that. And you'll see that still came through correctly, still looks just like we wanted it to. In fact, if I open up this original one I exported and tab back and forth between the two of them, you'll see there's no difference. These look exactly the same. So I was showing you that you can go into the source settings and apply these transformations, but in this case I don't need to do that. As long as my project color space and my export color space were set correctly, it's still going to do that conversion correctly to SDR. What I do want to show you as a pitfall is, let's say that I forgot to change this. So if I left my project at what it originally was when I brought in the clips, 2020 HLG, and then I go and try to export this clip, and you'll notice it says now that the project is something different. So it knows the project has changed, but I'm still using that same output color space. You might think that this will just sort of know like, oh, I got to convert from the one to the other because the project is one thing and I'm outputting as something else. Let's do that and take a look. And you can see this is like completely blown out for 3/4 of the image. This did not export correctly. It also brightened up and sort of color saturated my SDR clip some, so kind of both of these look wrong, but this is like completely useless. If we compare what that's supposed to look like, if you look here, I have kind of this demarcation where I have kind of a darker, like a gray over here and a white over here, and I've completely lost it. The whole thing is just blown out. I've lost all this detail, so that is not usable. So that's why it's really important to have it to make sure you're setting your project color space and your export settings correctly. Now if I do the reverse, so if I went and let's say I had remembered to change the project to 709, but then I go to export this, and my export settings are the same as the original clip, so I'll go to Rec 2020 HLG. And open that up. You know, this is not distorted as badly, but you can see everything's darkened up, right? So this still doesn't look right. Again, let me pull up to compare. Here's what I was trying to get. This clip's looking like this. And here's what I got instead. Everything's just darkened. If you look at the second clip, see, this is what it's supposed to be. This is what it looks like now. So again, this is not as egregious as the other problem, but I'm still getting something out that's not what I expected or what I wanted. So I really need to make sure to match up my export settings with my project color space the way that I'm trying to achieve. Now, let's say, again, I'm not recommending this for my students for work they're turning in, but let's say you want something that you actually maintain that HDR the whole way through. So you have HDR footage you shot and you want to keep that for your export and take advantage of that enhanced dynamic range. We can do that. So I'll go into my project settings and I'm going to go back to my HDR project settings, 2020 HLG in this case. And then when I go to export this, I'm going to do the same thing. Make sure that here's my project settings, here's my output color space, those are matching, and I'm going into this HDR color space at the end. Say save, and let's output that. And you can see now I have something that actually really does preserve this brightness and contrast range and is in fact an HDR image. You can see there's the HDR type. I'm in that 2020, 2100 color space. I think this particular export, it looks like actually kind of oversaturated the oranges a little bit. So I might have something else going on with that here. You can also tell, if I open this up again, you can tell that I was exporting that off of the transcode that I transcoded to a low resolution, because we're starting to see some banding here, because in this file that I transcoded, there's just not quite as much data. I transcoded as a low resolution, so that's why we're losing some of that. But this process does work to get me an actual HDR export, as you can see. So that's how to work with this stuff in Avid. I do want to show you one other quick thing, which is sometimes you do want to just convert a clip or a series of clips, and you could do this in Avid, but I actually think for conversions, it's often faster to do it in Davinci Resolve. It's also often a faster way to do your transcodes than doing them all in Avid if you have a whole bunch of stuff to transcode. So for instance, let's say I'd edited my sequence and I did want a sort of master copy in an HDR format. So I have this export, and let's say that's my master copy, and I do want to make an SDR version to use in whatever places I might need an SDR version. So to show in class in my case, if I'm using a projector that's not going to support HDR. So I could go back, change my settings like we just saw how to do that, and export an SDR version out of Avid. That works fine as well. But I just want to show you how you could do this in Resolve, because it's pretty quick. And if you do have a longer project, again, this project is like 2 seconds long, it actually can be significantly faster to convert it in Resolve than to do another export in Avid. So let me open up Resolve. And you can just start a new project or do this in some existing project, whatever you want to do. And I'm going to bring in that clip I want to convert. In this case, it's a different frame rate, so I'll just say yes, I want to change it, because I don't want to change anything else. I just want to kind of convert this clip. If you needed to change the frame rate or wanted, while you're doing this, to also convert the frame rate to something else, you could, of course, do that. And then I could throw this into a timeline. I'll show you a handy tip if you have a whole bunch of clips you're trying to do. I can right-click and just say create new timeline using selected clips, and it'll quickly build a timeline out of all of them. And if you want to change some of these settings, you can. I'm just going to leave it like this. So there is my clip in here. I'm going to click over to the Deliver tab, give it a name, location, and all these other settings, set the way you normally would for whatever you are trying to export for your audio and file settings. What I do want to note is in the video settings, this is where I'm going to have to check something. So this is actually a UHD clip. So if I wanted to export it in a UHD resolution, I could. I would actually want to go change my project settings to UHD first so that I'm not down converting it and then trying to upscale it. But we're talking about color space here, so let's focus on that. I'm going to go into these advanced settings here, and you'll see here I have some tags, and the default for these is always to just use the same color space and gamma as the project. So I could go change my project settings, and that works fine. Or I could just change this here, and unlike in Avid, I don't need to go change the project settings and then match the export to that. I can just change it here and things will work out fine. So in this case, I'm trying to make an SDR version. I'm just going to scroll down here and say I want to go into Rec 709, and I will select that for both my gamma tag and my color space. Make sure everything matches. Add it to the render queue, render, and I did not skip any time there. It's already done. It's that fast. And you can see it converted this to something that looks correct. If I compare this to my SDR outputs from Avid, tabbing between them, they look exactly the same. It's doing the same exact thing as that process that I ended up doing in Avid. There's my one from Resolve again. And if I go into the inspector, can look here and see it has correctly converted everything into that 709 color space. So that's a quick way to do conversions in Davinci Resolve. Hope that was helpful to you, and this whole HDR, SDR thing makes a little more sense now, and you know how to work with your media in Avid. I would say the most important thing from what I've seen from my students is just like be aware of this. If you're working with HDR footage and you're used to working with SDR, or you're trying to mix SDR and HDR stuff, it's not hard, but you got to take the time to make sure you know what you're doing and are aware like, oh, I need to be in this color space. And when I go to my exports, I need to set that to this color space, and I need to set my project to this color space. Just making sure you are taking that second to think about what kind of footage you have and make sure your settings are correct for it when you're bringing stuff in and when you're exporting, and everything will work great. Where you're running into problems is if you're not aware of this and just sort of throwing things into a sequence and you don't know what some of the color space settings are, and then you export things and things might not come out looking right. So hopefully you now know how to avoid that. I'll see you next time.